Well, first of all, I think I should say that we feel honored that we got the opportunity to present the results of our joint research on this occasion in a conference in honor of Adrien Héritier, whom I know quite for quite a long time. I don't say how long. We take as a starting point a hunch made by Philipp Schmitter a few years ago. I think it was in 2009. Something like politicization has happened since the 1980s. Obviously, this was rather a gut feeling than a precise empirical statement, and we took up the challenge in a large-scale empirical research project to analyze politicization of the European integration process. And we asked three main research questions, which will structure the presentation we will give in the following. First, we of course were interested in whether there is actually something like politicization. Can we really observe politicization, and what are its characteristic features? Second, we asked how can we explain politicization if it actually took place, and finally, if there is something like politicization, is it of a lasting nature? Has it really the capacity, the power to structure political conflict in the European Union lastingly, and how what would its impact for the future of democracy and of European integration be? What is the research design? Our research covered 4 decades, from the early 1970s, that is the period when evidence that the permissive consensus was reigning came up until more or less the present day. It included the most critical stages of the Euro crisis. We covered 6 West European countries: Austria, France, Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, and the UK. And we looked at politicization at public debates on every major integration step. We covered every integration step since the early 1970s. We looked at every national election campaign in these countries since the early 1970s. And we looked at protest events since the mid-1990s. So if there's something like politicization, we should have found it. And we actually did. And we used the methods as we also used in previous projects, that is quantitative content analysis and protest event analysis. I don't want to explain this in detail. What is important is that we employed a multi-dimensional concept of politicization, which took as a starting point political conflict. That is, politicization is the expansion of the scope of political conflict in our understanding. And of course this was inspired by Elmer Schatzschneider, who defined conceptualized politicization by visibility, by its scope, and by its intensity. So it's the visibility, the scope, and the intensity of conflict which is responsible for politicization or depoliticization, and we operationalize this by salience, the salience of an issue in a public debate, or in the scope of actors involved in such a debate or a campaign, and the constellation of actors, the polarization, the degree of polarization. And we combined these 3 dimensions in a composite index of politicization, and we use this index to measure the development of politicization in the various arenas. What's the main finding and the main argument? First and most importantly, there is no single uniform process of politicization. There is something like politicization, but it's not a single uniform process. Second, and what we observe is rather a pattern of punctuated politicization. It's moments of politicization, and the pattern is characterized by significant variation over time across countries and political arenas. Pardon? The volume went up. Okay. No, but this was not my of course, the challenge is then to explain this pattern of punctuated politicization, and we put particular emphasis on the strategic choices of actors in this context. This is what Swen will do. And finally, we certainly observe a clear-cut structure of political conflict on the European level, but the structuring effect of politicization at the domestic level has been rather moderate yet. This is something Hanspeter will then explain in more detail. Let me very briefly summarize the main empirical findings. We will not show you any graphs and any tables. Believe me, we have a lot of them, and if you ask the right questions, we may show you some in the discussion. First, there is evidence, there's clear evidence of politicization, as I already mentioned. We can observe intense conflict in each arena, not only in the electoral arena, not only in public debates. There is also some intense conflict. Swen persuaded me that there is also some intense conflict in the protest arena, although it's difficult to find. We find intense conflict in each country and in each period, not only in the post-Maastricht period, but the aggregate level of politicization has been rather moderate if we compare it with the most intense conflicts on domestic policy issues, and if we compare it with the most intense domestic conflicts on European integration as we find them in Switzerland. If we take the Swiss, debates on the bilateral treaties, we have much more intense conflict than at the aggregate level. There is no clear-cut trend over time. We find intense conflicts in the 1970s already, and it's not, there is no significant increase from the 1990s to the 2000s. There is significant variation across country. Most important, there is no single country which ideally represents the pattern of politicization which the politicization literature predicts. And there are different patterns of politicization across arenas. The pattern in the electoral arena is completely different than the one we find in public debates and the one we find in the protest arena, and there is no spillover, no interaction, no strong interaction effect between these various arenas, and there is also some variation in the individual dimensions, for example, salience and polarization. It's not, they vary quite considerably. This is what we call a pattern of punctuated politicization, and now it's Swen's job to explain this pattern.
Yes, so I have this nice job of explaining you all this variation. It will be a bit like flying over the Swiss Alps, so it will be very abstract what I have to tell you. Now, I think first thing we want to stress is that authority transfers to the EU might clearly induce political potentials into West European societies, but they do not determine the level and development of politicization, and we would really stress the factors related to actors' configurations and their mobilization strategies and political opportunity structures as explanatory factors. I think this might feel quite trivial from a comparative politics perspective, but when looking at the literature on politicization in EU studies, it already qualifies one of their main explanatory factors, which is actually this authority transfer and its causal effect on politicization. So there is, of course, another strand in the literature on politicization that has looked more on these actor-related factors, mainly coming from Gary Marx and Lisbeth Hoge on post-functionalism in EU integration, and of course also from these men next to me. And they would stress it's the radical right-wing and Eurosceptic parties that emphasize constitutive aspects of European integration and frame their criticism in a cultural identitarian ways that actually boost the level of politicization and bring it onto the agenda in Western Europe. So what can we say with our data at hand when it comes to these actor-related factors. What we really find is central for high levels, or this punctuated pattern, is the role of national political parties. So always when Europe really becomes part and parcel of domestic political competition, we observe higher levels. Or in other words, like the more Europeanized these debates, the less politicization we observe. But when we then look at the actor constellations, or kind of the actors that are responsible for driving these conflicts and increasing the salience, the polarization, and the actor expansion related to Europe, we need to qualify this focus on the radical right, because we clearly identify at least 3 paths that lead to high levels of politicization. Most importantly, we see it's still conflict between mainstream parties in government and opposition. Secondly, it's opposition by these radical right-wing parties in some of the countries and only at some moments in time. And finally, what is also important, especially when now looking at the Euro crisis and, for example, conflict in Germany, it's actually conflict within governing parties that is responsible for politicization. What we then can clearly kind of confirm is the hypothesis that it's all about the constitutive aspects of European integration. This can be seen, for example, when looking at the election campaigns. We do not observe any strong shift towards more policy-related conflicts in regard of European integration. And also when looking at the protest arena, where the level of politicization is rather low, we see there it is actually about economic policies, but they never kind of had such a strong mobilizing effect as the constitutive aspects of Europe. Then we also have rather mixed results when it comes to this cultural identitarian framing and the idea that actually by reframing Europe in this more cultural way, they were able to map it onto a second dimension. So what then comes back to Alex's point is the main effect when looking at institutional factors. We have a lot of them in the data, but the main effect is really referring to national referendum. So if you want to have politicization, you should hold a referendum. This I will just skip. And
a national referendum.
A national referendum, yes. Hand over to Hanspeter.
No, this is yours.
Yes.
Okay.
But
okay, it's always risky to be the third presenter when we have only 15 minutes. Okay, I briefly tell you what the consequences are in terms of structuration of conflict at the European level. We find 2 dimensions. One dimension we call the scope dimension. It opposes minimal market liberals and more encompassing integrationists who want to go beyond minimal markets, go to re-regulation in economic terms, strengthen central foreign policy, and increase the cooperation in justice and migration matters. The second dimension is a sovereignty dimension. It opposes intergovernmentalists and supranationalists. These 2 dimensions have been found before, and we are closest to Tanja Börzel's distinction between level and scope as dimensions. We are opposed to, for example, Jorge Marx or Hicks and Lord, who find a left-right dimension as the first dimension. Identity conflicts have not showed up as one of the dimensions. They are not structuring in fundamental terms because they are mainly relevant in accession conflicts, but not continuously in this shift of authority to the central supranational level. Now, within this 2-dimensional space, we find 4 stable actor clusters. The scope dimension gives mainly rise to 3 clusters of Europeanists, which have different visions of European integration. We have the integrationists, made up essentially of the supranational actors plus their national allies, and their most important national ally is the German government. They fully endorse the ongoing integration process. Then we have a second cluster, which we call the protectionists, led by the French and the Italian government. They are more skeptical about economic liberalization. And then we have the neoliberals, led by the British government and their allies, which endorses market liberalization and enlargement, but not much else. And these three clusters are opposed to the Eurosceptics, which are mainly made up of parties. And this is an essential point. The major conflict is an intergovernmental conflict articulated by governments and supranational actors. The minor conflict, which we have seen in our data, is getting more important, but it is still minor compared to the major conflict, is an interpartisan, or you could say post-functionalist conflict. I skipped the domestic level because we didn't see much structuration. I would like to say one word about the structuration during the Euro crisis, because we have paid a lot of attention to this particular phase of Europeanization and politicization of European integration. We found a lot of salience, but little polarization and little expansion in terms of non-governmental actors. So it was mainly intergovernmental conflict as a result of the intergovernmental type of crisis management. Now, the question is how you interpret this phase of integration in terms of our politicization approach. And there are two interpretations. There are the neo-functionalist accounts, for example, Frank Schimmelpfennig. He says these decisions were actually deepening integration and they were protected against the constraining dissensus. There was a shift to so-called non-majoritarian independent regulatory agencies who are not accountable to the public, like in particular the European Central Bank. There were one avoided treaty modifications, and the Eurosceptics were essentially shut out from government. There is the post-functionalist account, which we actually would privilege, which says that such protection as are put in evidence by Frank Schimmelpfennig are only, or have only been possible by technocratic deformation. Now, the last word is, our idea is that this is highly speculative, but that it is this technocratic deformation which will be the future driver of politicization in not in neo-functionalist but in post-functionalist terms. And we give at the end of our paper 3 examples. The Cyprus crisis, where the parliament immediately rejected the idea of the Troika that depositors, the poorer depositors, should not be protected. Portugal, where the Constitutional Court declared parts of the austerity program as unconstitutional, and the European elections, of course, which were characterized by the rise of right-wing populists early this year.